Welcome back, everybody. This is episode 2 of Fantastic Firsts, the Marvel history show that we look at pretty much every single comic ever published by Marvel, at least the non-reprint ones, and look at the first appearances of the characters and places and things featured therein. This is episode 2, and we are on to decade number 2. Technically, the first episode we dealt with the couple comics that were published by Timely Comics, the predecessor of Marvel, in 1939, and now we move to the early months of 1940. And as we move to 1940, there's a quick note I want to share with you guys, and that regards cover dates. And so you may have noticed sometimes if you go to the store of your choosing, sometimes the magazines have, dates on them that say, sell through end of this month. And that's what comics did at the very beginning because they wanted to maximize the amount of time they were on the shelves. So if you published a book in October and said October 1939, for example, on the cover, then at the end of October, the person running the store would pull the book. But if you put a cover date of a later month, say December or January, then the book would be there until the end of that month. So you had more time to sell the book. And this was especially important in the early days when there was only a handful of publications by each publisher. So they wanted to maximize the amount of sales that they could make. And this does continue somewhat today. There is some publication versus cover date intentional discrepancy going on. But for the benefit of consistency and this show, we're just going to stick with the cover date and not the publication date, just because it's easier. It's easier to look at the cover and say, this is this month's book. And we're not going to mess around too much trying to, conflate the two or talk about each one. And things generally just go in the same line anyway, regardless of which one you follow. So we're just going to follow the easiest one. So that being said, the first couple books here in 1940 actually were published in late 1939. That's okay. Again, cover date. That's what we're looking at here. So January 1940 kicks off with Marvel's, Timely at the time, but their second series. And that series is Daring Mystery Comics. Of course, there's the flagship series, Marvel Comics, which then changed its name to Marvel Mystery Comics with their second issue, and now we have their second series. So this is the Timely publishers branching out and building on the success of their first series. So the first story, and this is set up in a similar way to Marvel Mystery Comics in that it is a collection of stories. Sometimes it's more anthology in nature, sometimes it's serialization with a lot of recurring heroes. So very similar to what they were doing in Marvel Mystery Comics. The first story in the first issue of Daring Mystery Comics here is the fantastic thriller of The Walking Corpses, which is an amazing title. Like, if that doesn't get you hooked, there's no hope. There's no hope for you. And this is the debut of Jack Castle. And he is one of the many mystery men that we're going to see running through these pages. Jack Castle's alias is the Fiery Mask for now. And he is a, mystery man. So masked. He has a mask that is all fiery. Looks pretty cool. And so that is the Fiery Mask here. This also features the first appearance of zombies with a kind of a asterisk on it in that they aren't the stereotypical, I should say, undead entities, undead zombies. They're more scientific zombies, so they're kind of referred to as zombie-type characters in the issue, so technically it is the first zombies in the Marvel Universe, but we'll get to the more commonly known Walking Dead-type zombies a little later on. But you also have to remember that zombies in literature are super common these days. And back then, it was just kind of the start to include them. So it wasn't really a dead walking type situation at that point in time. So scientific zombies, if I wouldn't object if you were like, this isn't the real first appearance of zombies. This is just science gone wrong. Fair enough. I'm not going to hold that against you. Story number 2 is Soldier of Fortune, John Steele. And we have kind of a precursor to Nick Fury, Captain Savage, in that here is a soldier fighting in what is assumed to be a world war. And we also have the first appearance of France here. And it's not specifically stated that it takes place in France, but we can infer that it takes place there because it's in the war. And there's a lot of people with French-sounding names around. So we're going to go ahead and say that it's set in France. It makes sense. This is the first appearance of France. Then we have the Texas Kid, and this is one of, a handful of stories that would come around every once in a while that never had a continuation. So the Texas Kid was a Western, never came back. This is his only appearance. So there you have it. Unfortunate for him, but there were a slew of more famous Marvel, timely, Atlas Western heroes that would come along. So if you are a Western fan, rest easy. They're coming. Next story is Monaco, Prince of Magic. And this is the top hat wearing kind of Zatanna and her father type magician. Those are from DC characters, Zatanna and her father. And, stage magicians who also have a bit of legit magic power. And that was Monaco here, the magician. And his love interest, at least for a couple issues, Josie Nottingham first appears here, and his nemesis, Mr. Moreau, also appears here. So that is the extent of the first appearances in this particular story. There's a text story next. Lots of text stories early on in the days of Timely and Atlas. It's The Thundering Terror of Gold Creek is the name of it, and we don't really get into text stories that much because they're not necessarily connected to the main universe. So moving on from that, we get to Flash Foster at Midwestern, where we have the first appearance of Robert, a.k.a. Flash Foster, who is a star football player for Midwestern. And this is where we kind of get to break a myth in that if you look at some sources, they'll say this is the first appearance of Illinois and Chicago because there's a Midwestern in Chicago. However, it's much, 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 much more likely that the writers of the story just wanted a kind of a generic collegiate name to go along with the story. So they picked Midwestern, and this is especially likely because the Midwestern that is in Chicago doesn't have a sports program, doesn't have a football program. So either the writers were playing a joke on that, or they were just using a generic collegiate name. And I definitely would side with the latter in that. So next story is A Case of Perone, and that involves another mystery man detective type character, the Phantom of the Underworld, aka Mr. Doyle Denton. And he is a doctor that gets involved with some very shady characters and eventually brings them to justice, as is often the case in these early days. Next, we have a little feature called Wartime Wonders, and that's just a really simple but fun page that is kind of a diagram section, educational section of some of the weapons used in the wars going on at that time. Then to wrap up this issue, we have Barney Mullen, Sea Rover, and this is a seafaring tale where Barney leads his ship into dangerous waters and delivers precious cargo. So Barney's first appearance is here, as well as the countries of Portugal and the Netherlands. They also feature in this story. That wraps up this issue of number 1 in the series of Daring Mystery Comics. We jump back to the one that started it all, Marvel Mystery Comics, issue number 3. Also cover dated in January. And the first story here is the Human Torch. He leads it off as usual. And not very many really huge first appearances here in this issue, but we do have the first appearance of Texas and the first appearance of Martians as a race. So the first time Martians came to visit was in this story, way back in early 1940. Nothing really going on in the Angel story. In the Prince Namor story, we do have the first appearance of a couple of significant figures. One is Chief John Wilson of the New York Police, and the other is Betty Dean, who is a character that is first tasked with capturing the Submariner, and then eventually becomes his ally. And that allyship lasts all the way into the days in the early 60s where Marvel chose to bring back Namor from his many-year slumber where he was not appearing for a few years. The Brooklyn Bridge also appears here for the first time, and the Brooklyn Bridge has some very significant moments occur throughout Marvel history, and this is the first time we see it in the pages of this story. The Masked Raider, we have Idaho's first appearance, so these are kind of, especially the Western ones with the Masked Raider, they're basically retroactive first appearances. There's nothing in the story typically to suggest a specific state or locale in these stories. Now, after these stories were published years later, in guidebooks and such, then we had editors and historians and new writers basically saying, this is where this happened. And so we have kind of that retroactive case here where this is the first time that Idaho shows up. And there's nothing to say it's not Idaho, but it is nevertheless a retroactive appearance where it was decided later. If there is some sort of documentation by a writer out there that would say, this is my intention, that it was Idaho or whatever other state it might be, then definitely we could say for sure first appearance at the time of publication. But with Idaho, it's more of a retroactive declaration. The next few we have American Ace. We've got a Khazar story, and then we have a text story, Siegfried's Suicide. Nothing there in the way of new first appearances. So we move to February, where we jump back. We're going to kind of just bounce back and forth for a bit because these are the only two series that are in existence at this point. So we've got Daring Mystery Comics. Again, and we have the first story here. And this is Zephyr Jones and his rocket ship. And this is kind of notable as one of the first times that we actually have the majority of the story going on in outer space. So it starts on Earth, and Zephyr Jones and his rocket ship take off, and most of the story after that takes place either inside the rocket ship or on a different planet, so in outer space. So we've got Zephyr Jones and his best friend, Corky Grogan is his friend's name, and they take off on the rocket ship together, and so outer space, first appearance here of outer space, which is kind of a very generic thing to say, but also noteworthy in that this is the first time that frontier is ventured into. Next, we have the Phantom Bullet, Scourge of the Underworld. And as you might guess, the Phantom Bullet shows up here, another mystery man, investigative type character, aka Alan Lewis is his secret identity. Then we go to Trojak the Tiger Man, who is basically a ripoff of Khazar, except he has a tiger instead of a lion, and nope, that's about it. That's about all the differences. It's just in a set in a different location in Africa. So Trojak appears here for the first time. His tiger, Baloo, B-A-L-U, so not like the Jungle Book bear. And Edith Alton, his kind of love interest, appears here as well as part of the scientific expedition into Africa that ends up with Trojak being introduced to this group of men from the West. Then we have K4 and his Sky Devils, and I love the names of the Sky Devils. So they're all pilots from a very specialized air unit, and K4, we never really know what his actual name is. He's just called K4. So there's that. We have Renee Dauvernier. And then we also have one of my favorite names, actually, seriously, in all of Marvel history, Ronald Wolverstone Claude. So there's a hyphenated last name. I can't think of a better pilot's name than Ronald Wolverstone Claude. So I'm a fan. Unfortunately, they didn't appear either solo or as a team very often after this appearance, but we have to enjoy them while we can. First appearance in this issue of Germany and also England, which means this is also the first appearance of the United Kingdom. So more countries popping up here as the timely comics go worldwide. Then we've got Mr. E, another Mystery Man tale. We've got Mr. E, who is the detective / mystery man type character. And we have the vampire, who is his nemesis. Now, it's not actually clear if the vampire is a vampire or if that's just the name he uses as his secret identity. So if he is an actual vampire, then this is the first appearance of vampires in Marvel history. If it's a code name, then it's not. So we don't really know, unfortunately, and it's kind of left up to our own imagination. So I guess that's all we have to go on. Then we have the Laughing Mask, and this is Dennis Burton, another masked mystery man type character, like the Angel, like the Fiery Mask, similar to the Phantom Bullet. So we have a lot of those type of characters coming along in this time frame. So he first appears here. As I said, Dennis Burton is his secret identity. Jumping back to Marvel Mystery Comics, we've got a Human Torch story that has the first time the Human Torch really goes up against superpowered individuals. There is a doctor by the name of Dr. Maniac, Manyac. So the clever, just so you know, the clever spellings of villainous names and characters does go back all the way to the beginning. And he has a group called the Green Flames, and they are essentially mimicking the Human Torch, except their flames are due to essentially sub-zero temperatures. So think of like dry ice type flames. I'm not sure if that exists or not, but that's essentially what's going on here. And Broadway also is the first time. Broadway is this is the first time Broadway shows up. And I don't usually really pick out like every single street, especially in New York, because it's like not fair, because so much happens in New York City. And it's like, oh, this is this street, and this is first and second and third. And here's the first appearance of each one of them. But Broadway is obviously a significant street, and it's also very specifically named in the story, so it's safe to say this is the first appearance. Nothing in the Angel or the Namor stories this time around as far as first appearances go. We've got a retroactive appearance for Utah in the Masked Raider story in a similar fashion to the last issue. Then we have a really fun debut, and that is Electro, not the Spider-Man villain, but the story is called Electro Marvel of the Age, and in it we have the robot named Electro. And this comes along with a very snazzy, retro-y, neonish banner above the story. One of my favorite pieces of art from early Marvel / Timely. And his creator, Professor Zog. And basically, Professor Zog controls the robot from a remote place and sends him in to take care of bad guys, take care of spy rings, take care of spies, which is the same thing as spy rings, I guess. But really fun beginning to his story here, and they do a good job of developing kind of this mission throughout the next few books as well. Then we have Ferret, Mystery Detective, which, as you again would probably guess correctly, is another detective story. Ferret is more like Sam Spade. He has a code name, but it's not a secret identity. It's just, this is what he's known as, Ferret. He's a detective, and he goes and solves cases. Doesn't wear a mask. He just ferrets out the clues, which is, I hope, what they were going for with that name. This is also the first appearance of Greenwich Village, which would be very significant later on as the area where the Sanctum Sanctorum of Doctor Strange is based. Leslie Lenroe, by the way. Leslie Lenroe. Yep. Leslie Lenroe is the actual name of Ferret, although he doesn't really disguise his identity. Then we have the Khazar story. Nothing really going on here. There's a villain by the name of Ed Kivlin that shows up, and he's not incredibly consequential to the future, but it is a change from the typical fat face villain in the story. If you don't know what I'm referencing when I say fat face, you have to watch the first episode because then it makes sense. Turning the page to March, and we've got our third series. So they're on a roll here. We're on March 1940, and Timely's got their third series, and this is Mystic Comics. So they join the ranks here. And again, very similar to the other books, bunch of stories packed into one issue. And the first one here is Flexo, the Rubber Man. And Flexo is also a robot, but unlike Electro, who is more of a dynamo juggernaut type shape, Flexo is very limber and flexible, as his name suggests. His inventors, Joel and Joshua Williams, are featured here for the first time, their first appearance. And then we move to the Blue Blaze. And the Blue Blaze, a.k.a. Spencer Keane, is another costumed hero. He looks a little more like the stereotypical like Justice Society type heroes that you saw from DC, in that it was one or two colored outfit and kind of a standard cowl mask. And he gets his powers. So actually, before I start, this story starts off with a really creepy, like really fun bit of artwork where there's some grave robbers coming to a graveyard to do their dirty deeds, and they're done dirt cheap. You better believe it. And a hand comes out of one of the graves, and it's the Blue Blaze coming back to life, and it's just great illustration. So his origin story is he is Spencer, that is in a superhero costume, ready to go to a party, and his dad's like, "Hey, I got this new invention. You should check it out." And it is essentially a blue flame that is evidently super powerful, and so he doesn't want anybody to get their hands on it. He's going to destroy it. Unfortunately, there is like an earthquake, basically, and the house collapses. Everyone's still inside, and everyone thinks that Spencer's dead. But fortunately for him, he was next to the Blue Blaze, and it kept him alive and put him in basically a coma, suspended animation. And he comes alive later and ends up an actual supervillain, not just dressing up as one for Halloween. So that is the Blue Blaze. Then we move on to Zephyr Jones, which is a continuation. It kind of jumps from Daring Mystery over here to Mystic, which actually didn't happen a lot. Most of the time, the stories, if they stayed, stuck around in the same magazine. But he jumps over here. Nothing new in the way of appearances, however. Then we have the 3 X's, and this is where we get into a retroactive first appearance again, because the 3 X's are, as of publication, apparently just 3 adventurers, masked men, detective type characters. And later on, it was retconned that they are actually the same people that went to Professor Horton's to look at the Human Torch in the first issue of Marvel Comics. Also the same scientists that worked basically in these issues right here behind me, or one issue of the Fantastic Four, where we saw the first appearances of the character that would later be known as Adam Warlock. So the Scientists Guild appears here as the 3 X's. Not really a first appearance of the characters, either retroactively or... So if they're on their own, it would be considered a first appearance of them as the 3 X's, but we'll leave it at that point. And just to kind of go over the retroactive thing too, in case you haven't watched the first episode, which you totally should, is that, comics by their nature change a lot more frequently, and you have a lot of writers, a lot of artists, a lot of changes happening. And every once in a while, there is a situation down the road where a writer says, wouldn't it be great if this was actually the case earlier? And they make a change that makes that happen. So that's the case here. You have the 3 X's, and later on, a writer said, hey, this would be great if they were also the Scientists Guild. And the Scientists Guild was also the same group of scientists that worked on the situation with Adam Warlock in the pages of the Fantastic Four books. So that's what we have going on here. They've got a story called The Deep Sea Demon, which features the first appearance of Dave Dean. Again, not too consequential a character, not a secret identity to be found. He's an undersea diver going after treasure. Meets a bad guy down there. Works out for him. Then we have The Blooded Ruby of Chung, which is starring Dacor the Magician. And we've got the first appearance of Dacor the Magician here as well, who does not, unfortunately for him, rate very highly on the totem pole of magicians and sorcerers for Marvel. Finally, we have the Dynamic Man. And in this story, it's the first appearance of Kurt Cohen, who is a member of the FBI. So this is also the first appearance of the FBI, because you do actually see him with his coworkers. Do they call? The FBI calls each other coworkers, I think. Hopefully. And he is exposed to an experiment that gives him superpowers, so he becomes Dynamic Man. So Kurt Cohen, Dynamic Man, first appearance here, along with his colleagues. I'm sure that's what they called each other in the FBI. And moving from there, we don't have I was going to say Dynamic Mystery, but that's not the title. We don't have a Daring Mystery Comics for this month. We do have Marvel Mystery Comics for this month, and not a lot going on here. The Human Torch story features the first appearance of New Jersey, also the first appearance of Lake Superior, which is really close to home for me because that is about a 10-minute drive right down the road for me. So, haven't seen the Human Torch flying around, unfortunately. Bummer. And then in the Ferret story, we have the first appearance of an actual ferret named Nosy. And he is surprisingly cunning and comes in handy very much through the adventures of the human ferret. So Nosy the Ferret, his first appearance is here. And that wraps up March for, I almost said 2040. This is not the same century. 1940. Wraps up March. We'll take some chunks of months at a time, but that's where we're going to stop today. And it will just gradually evolve as more or less comics, more or fewer, as fewer or more comics are published per month. So if you've got a month with just 2 comics, then we'll lump that in with a bunch of other ones. But glad you enjoyed the show. I hope you enjoyed the show. Glad you're with us. And stay tuned to Daventry Studios and Fantastic Firsts as we make our way through the Marvel Universe, looking at comic books, first appearances, and historic, fun little tidbits. Again, we're going back, so we have a first-hand, first-tier source so that you don't have to rely on second tiers to know when the first appearances of your favorite characters are. So thanks for watching. We will be back next time as we jump farther on into Timely Comics in the year of 1940. Have a good one, and make mine Marvel. I'm supposed to say that at the end of the show because that feels cool. But yeah, thanks for watching.